The morning fog clung to Lake Michigan like a shroud as Detective Maria Valdez pulled into the Chicago Police Department parking lot on March 15, 2025. 9 years had passed since the Brooks brothers vanished without a trace, and the case file had grown thick with dead ends and false leads. At 42, Maria had worked hundreds of missing person cases, but something about the disappearance of 12-year-old Danny and 15-year-old Kevin Brooks had never left her alone. Their faces stared back at her from the cold caseboard every morning, two kids from Pilsen who had simply walked out of their grandmother's apartment on a bitter February evening in 2016 and never came home. The case had consumed the city's attention that winter. Danny, with his gap-toothed smile and Cubs jersey that he wore religiously, and Kevin, the protective older brother who carried himself with the weight of responsibility that came from growing up too fast in a neighborhood where childhood was often cut short. Their grandmother, Rosa Brooks, had raised them since their parents died in a car crash 3 years earlier. She had stepped out to buy groceries, leaving the boys with strict instructions to stay inside and finish their homework. When she returned 2 hours later with bags full of food for Sunday dinner, the apartment was empty, except for Kevin's math textbook lying open on the kitchen table, and Danny's beloved baseball glove abandoned by the door. If you're following this story and want to hear more mysteries like this one, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you these incredible true stories. Now let's dive deeper into what happened that cold February night. The initial investigation had been textbook. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed friends and teachers, and followed every possible lead. The boys' school counselor mentioned that Kevin had seemed distracted lately, but attributed it to the approaching anniversary of their parents' death. Their few friends reported nothing unusual. Danny had been excited about trying out for Little League when spring came, and Kevin had been talking about getting a part-time job to help Rosa with expenses. Security cameras in the area were sparse, and those that existed showed nothing conclusive. The boys seemed to have simply vanished into the Chicago winter. Rosa Brooks aged a decade in the weeks following their disappearance. The 67-year-old woman, who had once been the backbone of her church community and the unofficial mother figure to half the kids in the neighborhood, became a hollow shell of herself. She spent her days walking the streets of Pilsen, showing pictures to anyone who would look, her voice growing hoarse from calling their names. The community rallied around her initially, organizing search parties, distributing flyers, holding vigils at St. Paul's Catholic Church, where Rosa had worshipped for 30 years. But as weeks turned to months with no developments, the volunteers drifted away to their own lives, leaving Rosa to maintain her solitary vigil. The media attention had been intense but brief. Local news stations ran the story for several weeks, featuring heart-wrenching interviews with Rosa pleading for her grandson's safe return. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story about the Pilsen brothers, and for a time their pictures were everywhere, on bus stops, in store windows, on telephone poles. Tips flooded in from across the city and beyond. Psychics called claiming to have visions. Well-meaning citizens reported sightings from Milwaukee to Memphis. Each lead was dutifully investigated and ultimately dismissed. By summer, the story had faded from public consciousness, just another tragedy in a city that saw too many. Detective Valdez had been a patrol officer in 2016, working the overnight shift in a different district. She'd only become aware of the Brooks case when she transferred to the detective division 2 years later and was assigned to review cold cases. Something about the circumstances troubled her from the beginning. Two brothers, close in age and devoted to each other, don't simply decide to run away on the same night, especially not in February when the temperature was below freezing. There was no history of abuse in the home. Social services had investigated thoroughly after the parents' death, and Rosa had been nothing but loving and attentive. The boys had no money, no transportation, and no apparent reason to leave. But what bothered Maria most was the complete absence of any trace. In her experience, even the most carefully planned disappearances left some kind of trail: a withdrawn bank account, a deleted social media post, a friend sworn to secrecy. The Brooks brothers had left behind nothing except questions and an old woman's broken heart. Maria had inherited the case from Detective Robert Kane, who had retired in frustration after 3 years of chasing shadows. Kane had been thorough but traditional in his approach, focusing on runaway scenarios and potential abductions. Maria brought a different perspective, one informed by years of studying pattern crimes and understanding how predators operated in urban environments. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Dr. James Whitmore, a forensic anthropologist from Northwestern University, had been hired by the city to examine remains discovered during construction projects around Chicago. In early March 2025, workers breaking ground for a new community center in Bridgeport had uncovered what appeared to be human bones buried beneath an old foundation. The remains were fragmented and weathered, but Dr. Whitmore's initial examination suggested they belonged to 2 juveniles who had died approximately 8 to 10 years earlier. Maria received the call on a Thursday morning while reviewing the Brooks file for what felt like the 1,000th time. "Doctor." Whitmore's voice was measured and professional, but she could hear an undercurrent of excitement. "Detective, I think you're going to want to see this. The dental records we pulled from these remains. They're a match for your missing Brooks brothers." The construction site in Bridgeport was only 3 miles from the boys' last known location, but it might as well have been on another planet in terms of the investigation's previous focus. Bridgeport was an older neighborhood, historically Irish and Italian, that had been slowly gentrifying over the past decade. The lot where the remains were found had been vacant since 2010, when the city had demolished a cluster of deteriorating row houses. Before that, it had been home to the Kowalski family for over 50 years, until the elderly couple moved to a nursing home, and their adult children sold the property to a developer who ran out of money before breaking ground. Maria stood at the edge of the excavation pit, watching the forensics team carefully sift through decades of accumulated debris. The March wind cut through her coat, carrying the scent of Lake Michigan and the promise of another harsh Chicago spring. Dr. Whitmore approached, pulling off his work gloves and nodding toward a series of marked evidence bags. "The remains were buried about 4 feet down," he explained, his breath visible in the cold air. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing. The bodies were wrapped in tarps and covered with lime to accelerate decomposition. If not for the construction, they might never have been found." The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Suddenly, what had been treated as a missing persons case was officially a double homicide. The FBI was called in, given the possibility that the crime involved transporting victims across state lines. The Chicago Police Department's homicide division took over from missing persons, and Maria found herself working alongside seasoned detectives who specialized in the city's most violent crimes. But she had spent 3 years living with the Brooks case, and she wasn't about to be pushed aside now. The forensic evidence painted a grim picture. Both boys had suffered blunt force trauma to their skulls, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The killer had been methodical, not only in concealing the bodies, but in removing any trace evidence that might lead back to them. No clothing, jewelry, or personal items were found with the remains. Even more disturbing, the positioning of the bones suggested the boys had been killed elsewhere and transported to the burial site, meaning their killer had access to transportation and had planned the crime carefully. Rosa Brooks collapsed when Maria delivered the news. The 76-year-old woman had spent 9 years clinging to the hope that her grandsons were alive somewhere, perhaps living with a family who had taken them in, or old enough now to make contact on their own. The confirmation that they had been dead all along shattered something fundamental in her. Maria sat with her in the small living room of the Pilsen apartment, surrounded by photographs of Danny and Kevin at every age, watching as the last of Rosa's strength finally gave way to grief. "I always knew," Rosa whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of traffic on 18th Street. "In my heart, I always knew they wouldn't have stayed away so long. They were good boys. They would have come home." The investigation took on new urgency with the confirmation of murder. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile of the killer, likely a white male between 25 and 45 years old, with knowledge of the Bridgeport area and access to tools and transportation needed to bury bodies. The methodical nature of the crime suggested someone with experience, possibly military or construction background. Most significantly, the location and circumstances indicated that this was unlikely to be a random crime. The killer had targeted the Brooks brothers specifically, or had encountered them in a situation where he felt compelled to silence them permanently. Detective Jake Morrison from Homicide became Maria's primary partner on the case. Morrison was a 20-year veteran who had worked some of Chicago's most notorious murders, including several involving children. He brought a grim pragmatism to the investigation that complemented Maria's intuitive approach. Together, they began the painstaking process of reconstructing the boys' final day, looking for any detail that previous investigations might have missed. The timeline was frustratingly simple. Rosa had left for the grocery store at approximately 4:30 p.m. on February 18, 2016. She had walked to the local Jewel Osco 3 blocks away, spent about an hour shopping, and stopped to chat with neighbors on her way home. Security cameras at the store confirmed her presence there between 5:15 and 6 p.m. She returned to find the apartment empty, with no signs of struggle or forced entry. The boys had simply vanished sometime during that narrow window when they were alone. Morrison focused on the physical evidence, while Maria delved into the social dynamics surrounding the Brooks family. The boys' parents, Michael and Lisa Brooks, had died when their car was struck by a drunk driver on the Dan Ryan Expressway in December 2013. Michael had worked as a mechanic at a garage in Little Village, while Lisa had been a nurse's aide at Rush University Medical Center. They had been devoted parents who kept their children away from the gang activity that plagued parts of the neighborhood, enrolling them in church programs and ensuring they focused on their studies. After the accident, Rosa had taken in her grandsons without hesitation, despite her limited income from Social Security and a small pension from her late husband's job at the steel mills. The family had received a modest settlement from the drunk driver's insurance, which Rosa had used to pay off Michael and Lisa's debts and put aside money for the boys' education. There had been no family conflicts over inheritance, no custody disputes, no reason for anyone to target the children for financial gain. The boys themselves had been remarkably well-adjusted considering their tragic circumstances. Kevin had maintained a B average at Benito Juarez Community Academy and had talked about studying engineering in college. Danny had struggled more academically, but was gifted athletically and had dreams of playing baseball professionally. Their teachers described them as close-knit and protective of each other, with Kevin often serving as Danny's advocate when his younger brother got into minor scrapes at school. As Maria dug deeper into the boys' lives, she began to notice small details that had been overlooked in the original investigation. Kevin had been asking questions about their parents' death in the weeks before he disappeared. Not typical grief counseling questions, but specific inquiries about the accident itself. He had visited the branch library downtown to access newspaper archives about the crash, and had even attempted to contact the investigating officer from the Illinois State Police. The revelation came through Kevin's school counselor, Mrs. Patricia Fernandez, who had worked at Juarez for over 15 years. Maria interviewed her on a grey morning in late March, sitting in the counselor's small office decorated with motivational posters in both English and Spanish. Mrs. Fernandez was a soft-spoken woman who genuinely cared about her students, and she had been haunted by Kevin's disappearance for nearly a decade. "He came to see me about 2 weeks before he vanished," she recalled, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Kevin wasn't the type to ask for help easily. He was very proud, very responsible, but he seemed troubled about something. He asked me how he could get copies of police reports, what kind of information would be in them. I thought he was maybe doing a school project about his parents, trying to process his grief. Now I wonder if he had discovered something. Mrs. Fernandez had encouraged Kevin to focus on healing rather than dwelling on the details of his parents' death, advice that now seemed tragically misguided. She had offered to arrange counseling sessions, but Kevin had declined, saying he just needed to figure some things out on his own. It was the last time they had spoken. Maria and Morrison began investigating the original accident with fresh eyes, pulling files that hadn't been examined in years. Michael and Lisa Brooks had been driving home from dinner at Lisa's sister's house in Oak Lawn when their car was struck by Thomas Riley, a 34-year-old construction worker with a blood alcohol level twice the legal limit. Riley had run a red light at 55th and Western, T-boning the Brooks Honda Civic at nearly 50 miles per hour. Both parents had been killed instantly. Riley had survived with minor injuries and had eventually pleaded guilty to 2 counts of vehicular homicide. He had served 4 years in prison and been released on parole in late 2017. The case had seemed straightforward at the time, a tragic but unfortunately common scenario in a city where drunk driving claims dozens of lives each year. The investigating officer, Trooper William Hayes, had been thorough in documenting the scene and gathering evidence. Riley had shown no remorse during his arrest or trial, appearing in court with the cocky indifference of someone who viewed the whole proceeding as an inconvenience. His lawyer had negotiated a plea deal that many observers felt was too lenient, but the family had been too grief-stricken to fight for a harsher sentence. Morrison ran a background check on Thomas Riley, now 43 years old and supposedly living in Cicero under the terms of his parole. What they discovered was disturbing. Riley had violated his parole conditions multiple times, failing to report to his parole officer and moving without permission. There were also indications that he'd been drinking again, with 2 arrests for public intoxication that had somehow been plea bargained down to misdemeanors. Most significantly, his last known address put him less than 2 miles from where the Brooks brothers had lived. The pieces began falling into place with terrifying clarity. Kevin Brooks, intelligent and determined despite his young age, had somehow uncovered information about his parents' killer that had prompted him to dig deeper. Perhaps he had learned about Riley's parole violations, or discovered that the man who had destroyed his family was living nearby with apparent impunity. The timing of his research at the library coincided perfectly with the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago weather as she considered the implications. A 15-year-old boy, armed with nothing but righteous anger and teenage recklessness, had likely confronted the man who had killed his parents. The question was whether he had gone alone or brought his younger brother with him. Finding Thomas Riley proved more challenging than expected. His last known address in Cicero was a run-down apartment building where the superintendent claimed never to have seen him. His parole officer, overwhelmed with a caseload of over 200 offenders, admitted that Riley had been out of contact for months, but insisted that the paperwork to issue a warrant had been held up by bureaucratic delays. The system that was supposed to monitor dangerous criminals had failed the Brooks brothers just as completely as it had failed their parents. Morrison's contacts in the Illinois Department of Corrections helped track Riley's movements through various databases and surveillance systems. Credit card records showed purchases at gas stations and convenience stores throughout the Chicago area, but no permanent address. Cell phone records were more revealing. They showed that Riley's phone had been active in the Pilsen neighborhood on several occasions in early 2016, including the evening the boys disappeared. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Carmen Vasquez, an elderly woman who lived 2 blocks from Rosa Brooks, contacted the police after seeing news coverage about the discovery of the boys' remains. She had been hesitant to come forward earlier because she wasn't certain about what she had witnessed, but the confirmation that the boys were dead had convinced her to share her story. Mrs. Vasquez had been walking her small dog on the evening of February 18, 2016, when she noticed 2 boys talking to a man near a pickup truck parked on Ashland Avenue. The boys matched the description of Danny and Kevin Brooks, and the man was white, middle-aged, and appeared agitated. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Kids talked to strangers all the time in the neighborhood. But she remembered being struck by how the older boy seemed to be arguing with the man, gesturing emphatically while the younger one stood slightly behind him. The little one looked scared, Mrs. Vasquez told Maria during an interview at the police station. But the older boy, he was standing up straight, like he was trying to be brave. I thought maybe they were in trouble for something, like the man was a teacher or someone from their church. I never imagined. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Mrs. Vasquez's description of the truck matched a vehicle registered to Thomas Riley, a blue Ford F-150 with Illinois plates. The timing aligned perfectly with the window when the boys would have been alone in the apartment. Maria could picture the scenario. Kevin, armed with information about his parents' killer, had somehow arranged to confront Riley. Maybe he had called him. Maybe he had simply seen him in the neighborhood and seized the opportunity. Danny, loyal and protective despite being the younger brother, had refused to let Kevin go alone. The confrontation had escalated beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Riley, already unstable from years of drinking and probably panicked at being discovered by his victim's children, had made a split-second decision that condemned him to life as a killer. The boys had been taken somewhere, maybe to the very construction site where they were found, maybe to another location first, and murdered to prevent them from exposing his parole violations and his continued presence in their neighborhood. Tracking down Thomas Riley became the investigation's top priority. The FBI issued a federal warrant for his arrest on charges of violating interstate transportation laws, while Chicago PD issued local warrants for questioning in connection with the murders. His photograph was distributed to police departments across the Midwest, and a tip line was established for the public. The call came on April 3, 2025, from a motel manager in Gary, Indiana, who recognized Riley from news coverage. The Sunset Motel was exactly the kind of place where someone hiding from the law might hole up, cash only, no questions asked, and a manager who minded his own business. But even criminals occasionally watched the news, and when the manager saw Riley's face on the evening broadcast, he decided that harboring a child killer was bad for business. Maria and Morrison made the drive to Gary with a tactical team from the Chicago PD and FBI agents from the Violent Crimes Task Force. The Sunset Motel sat on a commercial strip that had seen better days, surrounded by abandoned factories and empty lots that spoke to the area's industrial decline. Riley was in room 247, a ground-floor unit with faded curtains and a door that had been painted so many times that the frame barely fit properly. They found him passed out drunk at 2 p.m., surrounded by empty beer cans and takeout containers from the past several days. The room reeked of alcohol, unwashed laundry, and desperation. Riley had aged badly since his prison release. His face was bloated and red from years of drinking, his hair was thinning, and his body showed the effects of a lifestyle built around avoiding responsibility. When they woke him to place him under arrest, he initially seemed confused about why police were there, as if he had convinced himself that his crimes would never catch up with him. The arrest was anticlimactic after 9 years of investigation. Riley offered no resistance as they cuffed him, mumbling something about needing a lawyer and asking if someone could feed his cat. There was no cat in the motel room. The blue Ford pickup was parked outside, its paint faded and its bumper held on with duct tape. Inside, forensics teams would later find trace evidence linking it to the crime scene in Bridgeport. Fibers that matched the tarps used to wrap the boys' bodies, soil samples that were consistent with the burial site, and most damning of all, a small baseball card that had belonged to Danny Brooks wedged between the seat cushions. Thomas Riley's confession came in pieces over several days of interrogation. At first, he denied everything, claiming that he had never seen the Brooks boys and didn't even remember their parents. But when presented with the physical evidence and witness testimony, his story began to change. He admitted to being in Pilsen that night, but claimed he was just visiting a friend. Then he acknowledged talking to the boys, but said they had approached him, not the other way around. Finally, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of the death penalty, Riley broke down and told the truth. Kevin Brooks had indeed tracked him down, armed with information about his parole violations and his continued presence in the neighborhood. The 15-year-old had threatened to report him to authorities unless he turned himself in and served the remainder of his original sentence. Riley, already drinking heavily that day and panicked at the prospect of returning to prison, had convinced the boys to get in his truck to talk about it somewhere private. He had driven them to the construction site in Bridgeport, intending initially just to scare them into silence, but Kevin had refused to back down, continuing to demand that Riley take responsibility for his crimes and face justice for killing his parents. In a moment of rage, fueled by alcohol and desperation, Riley had struck Kevin with a tire iron he kept in the truck. Danny had tried to run, but Riley had caught him and killed him too, unable to leave a witness to his crime. The burial had been methodical, carried out over several hours that night, using construction tools left behind by previous contractors. Riley had wrapped the boys in tarps purchased earlier that day, covered them with lime, and buried them deep enough that he thought they would never be found. Then he had cleaned his truck, disposed of their personal belongings in various dumpsters around the city, and tried to convince himself that he could live with what he had done. The confession brought a measure of closure to Rosa Brooks, though nothing could truly heal the wound of losing her grandsons. She had spent 9 years wondering what had happened to them, torturing herself with possibilities that ranged from human trafficking to runaway scenarios to accidental death. Knowing that they had died, trying to seek justice for their parents, was both devastating and oddly comforting. It confirmed that they had remained the brave, principled boys she had raised them to be, even in their final moments. The trial of Thomas Riley began in September 2025, exactly 9 years after the boys' disappearance. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Rebecca Martinez, laid out a compelling case built on physical evidence, witness testimony, and Riley's own confession. The defense argued that Riley had been drunk and panicked, that he had never intended to hurt the children, and had acted in a moment of temporary insanity brought on by years of guilt and alcohol abuse. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of concealing a homicidal death, and multiple counts of violating parole conditions. The judge, noting the particularly heinous nature of crimes against children and Riley's complete lack of remorse over the years, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rosa Brooks was present for the verdict, sitting in the front row of the courtroom, surrounded by friends from her church and neighbors, who had never stopped believing that justice would eventually be served. She had aged visibly during the trial, the stress of reliving her grandson's final hours taking its toll on her already fragile health. But when the guilty verdict was read, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude in Spanish, finally able to believe that Danny and Kevin could rest in peace. The case officially closed on October 15th, 2025, nearly 10 years after it began. Detective Maria Valdez filed the final report, noting that while the investigation had taken far too long, the persistence of law enforcement and the cooperation of the community had ultimately brought a child killer to justice. She kept copies of Danny and Kevin's school photos on her desk, not as reminders of failure, but as symbols of the importance of never giving up on victims who couldn't speak for themselves. The Brooks brothers were laid to rest in a ceremony that drew hundreds of mourners from across Chicago. They were buried next to their parents in Graceland Cemetery, their headstones bearing simple inscriptions that captured the essence of their short lives. Beloved grandsons who never stopped fighting for what was right. Rosa Brooks, now 77 and in declining health, visited their graves every Sunday after church, bringing fresh flowers and stories about how their memory continued to inspire others in the community to stand up against injustice. The case had lasting impact beyond the courtroom. The Illinois Department of Corrections implemented new tracking systems for parolees, making it much harder for violent offenders to simply disappear into the system. The Chicago Police Department created a cold case unit specifically dedicated to missing children, ensuring that cases like the Brooks brothers would never again languish without regular review. And in Pilsen, a small memorial garden was planted in the boys' honor, featuring a plaque that read, "In memory of Danny and Kevin Brooks, who reminded us that courage has no age limit." Detective Valdez was promoted to sergeant 6 months after the trial concluded, recognition for her dedication to a case that had consumed nearly 4 years of her life. She continued to work cold cases, applying the lessons learned from the Brooks investigation to other families still waiting for answers about their missing loved ones. But she never forgot the 2 boys from Pilsen, who had taught her that sometimes justice takes time, but it's always worth fighting for. The story of Danny and Kevin Brooks became a cautionary tale about the failures of the criminal justice system and the importance of following up on parole violations. It was also a testament to the power of family love and community support in the face of unimaginable loss. Rosa Brooks, despite her age and grief, became an advocate for other families of missing children, working with support groups and speaking at conferences about the importance of never giving up hope. Thomas Riley began serving his sentence at Menard Correctional Center in southern Illinois, where he was placed in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes. Prison records indicated that he had made several attempts to appeal his conviction, all of which were denied. He received no visitors and maintained no correspondence with anyone outside the prison walls. Fellow inmates, even those serving time for violent crimes, shunned him as a child killer, one of the lowest forms of life in the prison hierarchy. The investigation had revealed how easily a violent criminal could slip through the cracks of an overburdened system. Riley's parole officer had been managing over 200 cases, making meaningful supervision impossible. Budget cuts had reduced the frequency of required check-ins and eliminated many of the programs designed to help offenders reintegrate into society. The result was a dangerous individual left to his own devices in a community where his victims' children lived, a recipe for tragedy that could have been prevented with proper oversight. 9 years after the Brooks brothers vanished into a Chicago winter night, their case finally reached its conclusion. The investigation had spanned 2 decades, involved dozens of investigators, and cost the city hundreds of thousands of dollars. But for Rosa Brooks, sitting in her small apartment surrounded by photographs of her grandsons, no amount of time or money could have been too much to spend seeking justice for Danny and Kevin. The boys had been laid to rest, their killer was behind bars, and their grandmother could finally sleep at night, knowing that the truth had been revealed. It was not the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending that honored the memory of two brave children who had died trying to hold a killer accountable for his crimes. In death, they had succeeded where the adult world had failed, ensuring that Thomas Riley would never again walk free to threaten another family. The Brooks brothers' story became required reading at the Chicago Police Academy, taught as an example of how persistence and attention to detail could eventually solve even the most challenging cases. Their photographs joined those of other young victims whose cases had helped change how law enforcement approached missing children investigations. They had become more than just statistics. They were symbols of hope for families still searching for answers and inspiration for detectives who refused to let cold cases remain forever unsolved.